It was a typical Tennessee summer night. The heat was no longer intense, but it never truly dissipated. The air remained heavy, clinging silently to the skin, making one slow down, easily believing that everything around them was still peaceful. In the darkness that stretched across the fields and small roads, the crickets chirped steadily, so familiar it was almost invisible. It was the sound of peace, a sound one hears all their life without ever imagining it could be accompanied by tragedy. Lewisburg slept soundly that night. The houses were bathed in the soft yellow light of porch lamps. Windows were slightly ajar, letting in the rare breeze. No one locked their hearts away from the darkness, for this was a small town where everyone believed they were safe, where children slept soundly while their parents believed that tomorrow would be just like today. At the end of Cedar Creek Road, a small white house stood silently in the night. Nothing remarkable, nothing to her name, just an ordinary house where a family believed they were living the simplest days of their lives. Inside, a 6-year-old girl slept soundly, her breathing even, her small hands clutching a familiar object that brought her a sense of security. If someone had passed by at that moment, they would have seen only a quiet summer night like any other. No cries for help, no lights switched on, no sign that in just a few hours this peace would be shattered forever, because some tragedies don't come with noise. They come very softly, creeping into the silence, just when people believe they are safest. The Ree family is the kind of family you'd easily find in any small town in the American South. Not wealthy, not flashy, but content in a very human way. They live at a slow pace, familiar with their neighbors, and accustomed to quiet evenings with only the soft hum of the television and the sounds of insects in the garden. Hannah Ree was the center of that world, 6 years old, with pale blonde hair and a smile revealing a missing front tooth. She loved drawing with crayons, running barefoot in the yard, and especially, she would never go to sleep without her old stuffed rabbit, which she always called her friend. For Hannah, the world was still a safe place, where adults were always nearby, and darkness was just something that existed behind the window. Claire, Hannah's mother, was a gentle and patient woman. She was accustomed to early mornings, preparing meals, reminding her daughter to brush her hair, and picking up toys scattered around the house. Claire's life revolved around her daughter, every little detail, every daily routine. She believed in that order, believing that as long as everything was kept in rhythm, the family would be safe. Mark Ree, Hannah's father, was a quiet man. After losing his job at the paper mill, he took the night shift at the Lewisburg automobile factory. The work was hard, the hours irregular, but he never complained. For Mark, being a father and a husband was more important than anything else. Every night after work, he would call home and ask the same familiar question. Had Hannah gone to sleep yet? Was the door locked? It was a family that believed tomorrow would be like today, and it was this simple belief that prevented them from realizing that, in just one night, everything they considered normal would never return. That morning was quite ordinary. Weak sunlight filtered through the curtains, and a thin layer of mist still clung to the grass along Cedar Creek Road. Claire woke up with the familiar thoughts of breakfast, waking her children for school, and another day that would be just like any other. She walked toward Hannah's room, still adjusting the light coat draped over her shoulders. Claire called her daughter's name once, her voice soft and warm, as it always was that morning. There was no answer. She smiled, thinking the little girl was still half asleep. Claire called again, a little louder. Still silence. As she opened the door to the room, a strange feeling swept over her. Hannah's bed was devoid of familiar presence. The blankets were askew, the sheets cold and flat, as if no one had slept there in a long time. For that brief moment, Claire stood still, her heart pounding so hard she could hear it. She stepped closer, pulling the blanket back completely. The bed was empty. The pillow lay on the floor, out of its usual place. And right under the window, Hannah's old stuffed rabbit lay sprawled out, its gray fur covered in dust. It was a toy the little girl never parted with, not even when she went to bed or to play at the neighbor's house. Claire's gaze stopped at the window. The screen had been ripped open, the cut clean and cold. Not an accident. Not the wind. Not the mischief of a 6-year-old. In the next few seconds, fear overwhelmed her faster than she could think. Claire called out her child's name in panic, running through the house, opening every door, bending down to look under the bed, in the closet, even in the most illogical places. But the house responded only with a heavy silence. In that moment, the peaceful morning vanished. A mother realized that something had happened in her own home. And from the moment she saw that empty bed, Claire's life, and the life of Ree's family, took a turn from which there was no turning back. In her panic, Claire lost all sense of time. Her hands trembled so much that it took several attempts to dial 911. When the line finally answered, her voice cracked and broke. She tried to speak slowly and clearly, but fear weighed heavily on her. "My daughter is gone. Her bedroom window is open." Just minutes later, the first police cars appeared on Cedar Creek Road. Their flashing blue and red lights cut through the morning mist, shattering the familiar tranquility of the area. Neighbors began peeking out of their doors, standing silently, none understanding what was happening, but all sensing that something was terribly wrong. The officers entered the small house, their voices low and cautious. They searched each room, taking notes and photographs. One knelt by Hannah's window, pointing to a faint mud stain on the windowsill. The mark wasn't large, but it was enough to make the whole room feel somber, as if someone had stood there in the night, watching a child sleep. Outside, another officer spotted indistinct footprints imprinted on the wet grass. They led toward a row of trees and then disappeared into the thick bushes. There was no clear direction, no answers, just fragmented pieces that sent chills down one's spine. Then a small detail was mentioned, almost unconsciously: the dog in the house. It hadn't barked all night, an old, gentle hunting dog, usually very sensitive to noise. That fact caused the officers to look at each other, silent longer than usual, because it meant either the dog hadn't heard anything or it hadn't felt threatened. In that moment, the last vestiges of safety crumbled. This wasn't just a lost child anymore. This was something more subtle, more terrifying. And right here in this peaceful home, on what seemed like an ordinary night, someone had entered, then left, taking a tiny life with them without a sound. In just a few hours, Lewisburg was no longer a quiet town. It had become a search zone. Checkpoints were set up on the roads leading out of town. Police cars lined up, checking every vehicle that passed, every unfamiliar face, every averted gaze. Everyone cooperated in silence, because no one needed an explanation as to why this was so important. The working dogs arrived that morning. The trainers crouched low, calling Hannah's name through handheld megaphones, their voices echoing across the open field. The dogs ran along the fence, through the tall grass, stopped, took deep breaths, and then continued. Everyone held their breath, waiting for the slightest sign. High above, the steady hum of helicopters echoed, circling over the forests and small streams. From the ground, people looked up, hoping the gaze from above could catch a glimpse of what they were missing. Each flight carried a sense of urgency, as if time were passing faster than usual. By midday, volunteers began to arrive. They came from nearby farms, from the church, from the small streets around town. Some carried flashlights, others brought water, and some simply stood ready to do whatever was needed. Mothers clutched their children tightly before leaving, their eyes betraying their fear. The entire community stepped out, venturing into the forest, the meadows, into places previously only used for leisurely strolls. Maps were spread out on the car hoods, areas marked with shaky ink pens. No one spoke, but everyone understood. With each passing minute, hope dwindled. As the sun began to set, no good news came. No clothes, no clear tracks, not a single sound to answer, Only exhaustion and anxiety hung heavy on every face. And in that moment, the whole town realized that this search was not just about finding a child. It was a race against time, against the greatest fear none of them wanted to face. As the search expanded, accounts began to emerge. Initially hesitant, they became more frequent, as if each person were trying to recall a detail that might save a life. A woman who lived nearby said she heard a car door close around 1:30 inches the morning. The sound was short, dry, and then silent. She had simply stirred, thinking someone was coming home late. Another person reported seeing a light flash in Ree's yard in the middle of the night. The light was dim and lasted only a few seconds. They assumed it was a raccoon or someone checking their enclosures. In a small town, people are used to ignoring strange occurrences, because most of the time, nothing bad happens. Then came a detail that made the investigators pause longer. An elderly neighbor said he saw a blue pickup truck parked near the end of Cedar Creek Road the night before. He couldn't remember the exact time. He couldn't remember the license plate. He only remembered it standing there longer than usual, as if waiting for something. The testimonies are recorded and placed side by side, but they don't match perfectly. The times are different. The details are inconsistent. Some are certain, others are confused. This contradiction doesn't clarify the picture, but rather obscures it. Amidst dozens of fragmented memories, no one can be sure what is true and what is merely fear added later. In the makeshift command center, the officers exchanged glances, understanding they faced a challenge far more difficult than simply searching. Because when clues came from people, they carried emotions, distorted memories, and regrets. Every account could be a key, or it could be a dead end. And as time passed, the truth remained elusive, hidden somewhere in the dim lights of the night and the blue car whose license plate no one could remember. Less than 24 hours after Hannah's disappearance, Lewisburg was no longer just a local story. Television vans began appearing early in the morning. Cameras were set up in front of houses. Cables stretched across lawns. Questions poured into a town accustomed to silence. Mark Ree returned home in his work clothes, still smelling of machine oil. He had just finished his night shift when he received the call. As his car turned onto Cedar Creek Road, the police lights reflected off his windshield, causing him to freeze. Mark pulled over in front of the house, got out, and collapsed to his knees. There were no loud sobs, just a father breaking down, realizing he had returned to a place that was no longer whole. Police had to restrain Mark when he tried to barge into the house. His child's bedroom had been sealed off. Everything familiar had become a crime scene. Mark later said that he felt like he was standing in someone else's life, a life he hadn't chosen. Claire stood before the camera for the next few days, her face weary, her eyes sunken from lack of sleep. She answered the same repetitive questions. When was Hannah last seen? Did she hear any noises? Was the door locked? Each question was like a small, regular cut, not bleeding but causing a lingering, painful ache. Then the gazes began to shift. Some whispered that Claire was too calm. Others analyzed every movement, every pause on her face. In a small town where everyone knew each other, suspicion spread faster than news. Compassion began to mingle with curiosity and judgment. Lewisburg changed in just a few days. Porch lights were left on all night. Children were no longer allowed outside after dark. Windows were shut tight. The innocence of a small town was taken away along with a child. And amidst the media frenzy, amidst the unanswered questions, the Ree family gradually realized that they had not only lost their child, they had also lost the sense of security that the whole town had once believed to be permanent. The following days passed in a state of semi-consciousness. The search continued, but the rhythm had changed. Gone was the initial urgency. Instead, there were lengthy meetings, stacks of reports, and a pervasive sense of deadlock in every room. Every morning, the same question was asked. Any news? And every afternoon, The answer was silence. As clues dwindled, theories began to proliferate. Some believed Hannah had been kidnapped by a stranger passing through town. Others whispered about family disputes, about secrets no one spoke of. Stories spread quickly, embellished through conversations at the grocery store, in the church parking lot. The truth was stretched, distorted, and then blended into collective fear. The investigation gradually went off track. Investigators focused too long on a few familiar hypotheses, overlooking small details that didn't fit the established pattern. The files grew thicker, but made no progress. Fragile evidence was shelved, awaiting review. The system worked its way, slowly and rigidly, while time waited for no one. For Ree's family, each day was a silent torture. Claire lived in a void between hope and despair, unwilling to let go and lacking the strength to believe. Mark threw himself into work, as if even a moment's stillness would allow the pain to catch up to him. They realized that it wasn't just the perpetrator of tragedy who was dangerous. Delays, wrong decisions, and things not seen in time could also take away an entire life. And as the town tried to return to its normal rhythm, a heavy feeling hung in the air, that somewhere, amidst the stacks of files and conflicting theories, the truth was being overlooked. Waiting, silence, like the very child they were all still searching for. Time continued to pass, silently, without asking permission. Weeks turned into months, months into years. The search narrowed, then quietly came to a halt, as if the town could no longer bear the weight. But for Ree's family, time did not heal. It only prolonged the pain in a different way. The house at the end of Cedar Creek Road is no longer filled with children's laughter. The windows are shut, the lawn is overgrown with grass, and the white paint is peeling under the sun and rain. People drive past slowly, gazing at the house with a chilling feeling. It's no longer a home. It has become a symbol of something that has never been truly closed. Inside, Hannah's room remained exactly as it had been on the first day. Claire still folded the blankets every morning, still tidied up the little things, as if her daughter were only temporarily away. That was how she survived, by keeping hope from completely extinguished. But that hope also prolonged the pain, leaving it simmering and inescapable. Mark chose a different path. He worked more, took on extra shifts, and came home later. The silence between the couple grew, filling the voids once filled with the laughter of their children. They no longer knew what to say to each other, because any words could touch upon unhealed wounds. Finally, they left that house, not because they were ready, but because they couldn't continue living within walls filled with memories. The marriage crumbled, not with arguments, but with prolonged exhaustion. Two people who had once built a family together now shared only one loss. For Lewisburg, Hannah's story gradually became a memory. For the Ree family, it was a daily reality. The pain didn't disappear with time. It simply learned to exist alongside them, silently, persistently, and never letting go. In 2002, after more than a decade of silence, Hannah Ree's case was reopened. At that time, DNA technology began to be mentioned more frequently in criminal investigations. For the Ree family, just hearing the words DNA was enough to make their hearts race. It was like a small door that had been locked shut for years. The faint bloodstain that had been found on Hannah's windowsill was brought out of storage. The technicians worked meticulously, step by step, with the faint hope that science had finally caught up with time. Claire waited in silence. Mark didn't dare ask many questions. They had both learned not to hope too much, because each time hope crumbled, it left a new wound. The results were brief and cold. The DNA sample was too degraded, not enough data to create a profile, no comparison, no new clues, just a dry conclusion, closing the door that had just been opened. To the outside world, it was just a failed attempt. For Ree's family, it was the moment the light went out. Hope, which had been held for over 10 years, now weighed more heavily than ever. Not because it disappeared, but because it had run dry. The files were put back on the shelf. The investigation fell silent again. And once more, Hannah was there, trapped between the past and the present, while time continued to tick away, leaving her family behind, not knowing how much longer they would have to wait. In 2016, when most people in Lewisburg had become accustomed to not waiting for anything, Hannah Ree's case was unexpectedly reopened. Not because of a new tip, nor because of a witness coming forward. The reason came from a very quiet place, a unit that handles cases that time has forgotten, the Tennessee State Cold Case Unit. In a room filled with old filing cabinets, a forensic analyst named Melissa Crane stopped at the name Hannah Ree. Melissa grew up not far from Lewisburg. She remembered the girl's face on those missing person flyers from years ago very clearly. It was one of the first memories that made her understand that the world wasn't always as safe as adults said. Melissa opened the evidence box, flipping through the faded documents and photographs. Then she saw it. A small, carefully sealed blood sample taken from the bedroom windowsill years ago. Something once considered useless, once put away because science at the time wasn't capable of explaining it. But 2016 is no longer 2002. Technology has changed. The old limitations have been pushed back. Melissa understands that even a tiny trace is worth trying again. Not because it's guaranteed to work, but because Hannah has waited too long. The blood sample was sent for retesting, as silently as the hope itself. No one dared speak out, but deep down, something began to stir. It was as if, after 25 years of silence, science was finally preparing to speak on behalf of a child who had lost the chance to defend itself. This test result was no longer the end of the road. From that tiny blood sample, analysts finally extracted an incomplete genetic profile, but one sufficient to begin a completely new direction. No name, no face, just cold numbers. But for the first time in 25 years, those numbers had a voice. The records are fed into a genealogical genetic analysis system, a very new and controversial method, but one that has begun to open doors to seemingly unsolvable cases. Instead of finding the perpetrator directly, investigators search for distant relatives, people who share even a small amount of DNA. The days of waiting dragged on in silence. Then a result emerged. Not the culprit, just a name from Alabama. A man never involved in the case, never having made the front page of a newspaper. But the genetic connection was undeniable, a thin thread linking the present to the past. From there, the picture began to become clearer. Investigators traced the family tree, branch by branch, name by name. Blood relationships gradually narrowed the circle. And then, another name emerged. A man who had lived in Lewisburg at the exact time Hannah disappeared, had worked in the area, had walked into houses that others trusted and opened the doors to. The clues led them from Tennessee to Alabama, from meaningless numbers to a flesh and blood human being. No more vague hypotheses. No more aimless speculation. For the first time in decades, investigators could pinpoint a real suspect, and at the same time, the truth, which had long been hidden, began to feel there was nowhere left to hide. The confrontation wasn't as dramatic as one might expect. No flashing lights, no shouting, just two investigators knocking on the door of a quiet Alabama house on a chilly, ordinary afternoon. The man who opened the door looked at them warily. He was older than his profile picture, his gray hair blending into an air of forced composure. The conversation began gently. Questions about the past, about the years spent in Tennessee, about old jobs. Everything seemed to be going smoothly until a detail was mentioned. Lewisburg, Cedar Creek. That year, the moment was brief, but enough to change the silence. Hands trembled slightly, breaths slowed. The investigators saw what they needed to see. They left without rushing, but soon after, the procedure for obtaining a DNA sample was completed. A cotton swab touched the oral cavity, a few strands of hair, tiny, seemingly harmless things. And then came the waiting time. heavier than any interrogation. The results were inconclusive. A perfect match. The DNA sample obtained from Hannah's windowsill all those years ago belonged to that very man. There was no room for doubt, no room for error. When the arrest warrant was executed, his reaction stunned everyone. No resistance, no questioning. He simply sat down, bowed his head, and spoke very softly. It had been a long time. That statement resonated like a belated acknowledgement, closing the chapter on 25 years of hiding. News spread quickly. Lewisburg was stunned. An unfamiliar name, an unexpected face. The truth finally came to light, quietly, mercilessly. And the whole town understood that the monster wasn't always terrifying. Sometimes it was simply very good at hiding, long enough to make people believe it never existed. The interrogation took place in a small room, the white light casting a cold glow on a metal table. The man sat opposite the investigators in long silence. His hands rested on the table, clasped together, as if trying to hold on to something about to slip out of his grasp. No one pressed him. No one raised their voice. The truth, at this point, only needed time. At first, he denied it, saying he didn't remember, saying it was too long ago. But memories don't disappear. They just lie, dormant, waiting for a moment to surface. When the photos were placed before him, when the name Hannah was uttered aloud, the silence began to crack. His breathing became heavy, his gaze averted, then settled on a point in the distance. After hours, the words finally came out, very softly. "I didn't intend to harm her." That sentence hung in the room, heavier than any other confession. He recounted that night, the drive in the dark, the deserted Cedar Creek Road. He spoke of cutting through the window screen, slipping into the room where a child slept soundly. Hannah awoke to a hand on her shoulder. She called for her mother, just a small cry, but enough to shatter everything. Panic overtook reason. He grabbed the child and rushed out into the darkness, believing he was still in control. But on the deserted road, everything spiraled out of control. Hannah cried, terrified, trying to run away. In that chaotic moment, an action occurred. There was no turning back, no undoing. The narrative lacked dramatic tension. There was no justification, just fragmented memories, spoken aloud after 25 years buried deep. When the confession ended, the room fell silent. No one felt victorious, only a chilling sensation as the truth finally emerged, naked and without any relief. That morning, the convoy silently turned off the main road, venturing deep into a forest forgotten by time. The man in the back seat gave directions in a monotonous voice, as if reciting an old memory. He spoke of a trail that had once been a logging path, of tall pine trees and a thick layer of dry leaves underfoot. There were no signs, no markers, only the memory of a man who had carried a secret for 25 years. The investigators stopped at a low-lying area where the sunlight filtered weakly. No one spoke. The air was so heavy that every movement slowed. The forensic team began their work, each shovel stroke careful, each layer of soil pushed aside. Time seemed to stand still. Every passing second carried both hope and fear simultaneously. Then there was a very subtle moment. A piece of cloth emerged from beneath the decaying leaves. The colors had faded. The hand stopped. No one needed to say a word. Everyone understood what it meant. The work continued in absolute silence, with respect for a tiny life that had waited so long to be found. When what remained was brought up from the ground, many bowed their heads. Some turned away to hide their tears. The police officers who had participated in the search years ago stood silently, their faces aged by time. 25 years ago, they had called her name in the forest. And now, finally, they had found her. Hannah was no longer lost. She was no longer caught between question and silence. After 25 years, that painful wait culminated in a heavy but necessary truth. Not a miracle, just the truth. And for her family, for the town, It was a moment that was both devastating and yet brought something very rare, a true farewell. The trial took place in a small room, but the atmosphere was so heavy it was suffocating. There was no usual commotion. Just rows of wooden chairs, downcast eyes, and a family that had waited too long to hear an irreparable verdict. When the defendant was led in, no one looked at him for long. Time had aged everything, including the evil. The accusation was read slowly. Each word resonated clearly, dryly. A 6-year-old child, a summer night, the bedroom. Those details were no longer news. They were memories. And for the family, each word was like a sharp cut, a reminder of something they never wanted to remember. When the judge pronounced the sentence, the room fell into absolute silence. The verdict was harsh. It was lawful. It was procedural. But there was no sigh of relief, no sense of closure. Because justice can punish, but it cannot bring back lost mornings. It cannot fill the empty chair in the kitchen. It cannot raise a child. Claire sat silently, her hands clasped together. Mark stared straight ahead, as if trying to keep himself from collapsing. They had completed their legal journey, but the void between them remained. Justice had been served, but the pain seemed endless. When the trial ended, everyone stood up and left. Ree's family lingered a little longer, in the room where a long chapter had just closed. Not relief, but a heavy acceptance. That some losses, even when brought before the light of justice, will remain silently for a lifetime. After the trial concluded, Lewisburg never returned to its former state. The small town had carried Hannah's story for over 25 years, and now, with the truth finally revealed, it left an indelible mark. People lived more slowly, more cautiously. Windows were locked each night, not just out of habit, but because of memory. Hannah's case became a silent reminder of what time can do, and what it cannot conceal forever. In forensic training sessions, genealogical DNA analysis was mentioned as a breakthrough. Forensic genealogy is not just a technique, it is patience encoded as science, the way humans answer questions that seemed lost. In those old storage rooms, where boxes of evidence are stacked one upon another, Hannah's story is recounted as a testament that sometimes evidence doesn't disappear, it just waits. Waits for technology to mature enough, waits for people to be patient enough to look back at it one more time. For those who participated in the search all those years ago, that legacy is very personal. They remember the calls echoing through the forest, the beams of flashlights sweeping across the tall grass, the feeling of helplessness as night fell without answers. Now, though the truth brings pain, it also offers a rare form of solace, that those efforts were not entirely meaningless. And for Lewisburg, the greatest legacy lies not in records or reports, it lies in how a community learned that silence isn't always the end. Sometimes, it's just a pause before the truth, guided by time and science, comes to light. Before we leave this story, let's take a moment to slow down, not to remember the crime, but to remember a child who once existed, who once laughed, who once believed the world was a safe place. Hannah is not just a name on a record. She was a life brought to a halt too soon. If this story resonates with you, please leave a comment. It doesn't have to be long. Just be honest. It could be your thoughts, a question that still haunts you, or simply a message for the family who waited 25 years to say goodbye. If you believe stories like these need to be told, please like and subscribe to the channel. Every support you give us, the opportunity to unearth old records, listen to forgotten voices, and remind us that there are truths that must not fade away with time. And before the video ends, ask yourself one thing. How many stories like Hannah's are still lying dormant in old boxes, waiting to be called out? Will we listen, or will we continue to walk past in silence?